All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to my session tonight. We're going to talk about the Salesforce data loader and how to script data loads into your Salesforce sandboxes and orgs. Real quick, a little bit about myself. I'm Scott Geosits. I'm a Salesforce.com architect with Varsity Brands. A little bit about Varsity Brands. Varsity Brands is basically the leader in student achievement. So there's a couple of companies underneath: Herf Jones, Varsity Spirit, BSN Sports. We cover the gamut from graduation and yearbooks and things like that, student achievement, school spirit via Varsity Spirit, the cheerleading camps, competitions, uniforms, and BSN Sports, who's like the largest sportswear manufacturer in the country. So our agenda tonight, we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to go over the Salesforce data loader, kind of high-level overview of the data loader and the different ways you can use it. We're going to talk a little bit about why you would use scripted data loads, what the benefits of doing that is. Then we're going to get a little bit deeper into data loader and some of the concepts behind setting up your data model to be able to pull in relationships and things like that. We're going to dig into Apache Ant, which is the actual scripting tool we'll use to pull this together. Then we'll talk about, once we have the ability to import and export from Ant, we'll talk about creating scripts to pull everything together and automate it so you can do entire data models with a single command. Then we have a hands-on workshop that you guys will kind of get to go through and do a lot of the same stuff I'm going to be presenting here. And then, of course, happy hour. So let's start off talking a little bit about the Salesforce data loader. So the data loader is a utility that Salesforce provides to allow you to export and import data from a Salesforce instance. It can either be a production org, it can be a sandbox. Everything is exported in CSV file format, and that's the format it uses for the imports as well. You can get to the data loader from within Salesforce, and we'll take a look at that, where to go to get the data loader. So it's actually available within Salesforce as a download. The data loader only works on Windows, the one in Salesforce. So if you're using a Mac like everyone here, sorry. However, there is a port of it called LexiLoader, which is a freeware port for Mac OS, and I've found it to work just as well as the regular data loader. So. And it also allows you to save off your mapping files for repeated operations. So if you're running the data loader from, in the actual data loader client, and you're just going to do your data loads that way, you have simple data loads to do, you can actually save your mapping files so that you don't have to keep mapping your CSV columns to your Salesforce object and field names. And the Salesforce data loader will actually let you load up to 5 million records. So it doesn't have the limitations like some of the other means of loading data do. So there's a couple of different modes for the data loader, different ways to use it. So the first way, of course, like I talked about, is the actual client application, which you can find in Salesforce if you go to Setup, Administer, Data Management, and Data Loader. So if we go over here for a second. Come over here under Setup. And you can either key in that full set of, click that full set of options, or you can just use your quick search here and under Data Loader here. So basically here is where you would download it. So if you click on that, it'll download an executable for Windows, and then you can run that. For Mac, like I mentioned, there's LexiLoader, which I have loaded here. LexiLoader is basically exactly like what the data loader would give you. So we can use it to, opening up in my other window here. Sorry. It's touchy. All right. Well, I could show you this later. The bulk of the presentation is not really around using the client version of it. What we want to talk about is how we can leverage kind of the guts and internals of that to do our automated data loads. So, so you know you can get that from within Salesforce. The other way we can do it is to, and this is the method we're going to talk about tonight here, invoking it from Apache Ant using the data loader jar file. So data loader is a Java application. It's got some libraries, one of which is a jar file that contains kind of the internals of it. And that's the method we're going to kind of take a look at in a lot of detail tonight. You can also schedule runs of the data loader. You basically do that from, if you have a Windows workstation, you can set it up to use the Windows task scheduler, and you set up your configuration pretty similar to how you do the Ant approach. And you would set up a batch file to go through that. So why are we interested in scripting the data? Why don't we want to just use data loader and load up CSV files? Well, let's take a look at an example. So you have your Salesforce org here, and you start loading some data into it, and that's great. And if we take a look at the rest of the topography, we have, you have a full copy sandbox, and you have a couple of other sandboxes. They could be developer sandboxes, QA, whatever. So basically what happens is you do a sandbox refresh, and that data then is going to get pushed down to the full copy sandbox. When you do a sandbox refresh for any other sandboxes, you don't get the data in there. So you have to go through, and you have to load up every sandbox by hand and put your data in there. And that's great if you have a small amount of data, but now you get a little bit more data in your main production org. Okay, so you do your refresh and you get all that data down in your full copy sandbox, but now your other sandboxes are wiped out. There's no data that comes down with them. So you go back in by hand and you load up your data bit by bit by bit until you have all your sandboxes back up to, caught up to what your production org has, or at least enough data that you can do your testing and development with. And then you start to get a lot of data in your production org. And of course, when you do your refresh, everything comes down to the full copy sandbox, but everything else is wiped out from your other sandboxes, which is really enough, to make you do this. Or in practice, it ends up being probably a lot closer to this here. So, watch. Wait for it. See eyeball. So there's got to be a better way, right? So we talk about scripted data, and some of the benefits we get from doing scripted data are we have predictable data sets. So we can set up CSV files that we know what data is in there, and we can set them up for QA, for development, different flavors of development. Depending on what you're doing, we can define those CSV files to have as much or as little data as we need to do our job. It allows you to do an easy reload of data after you do production refreshes, like I just showed. And you should be refreshing your sandboxes from production often. At a minimum, you should be doing it after every production release. If you don't have a way of easily getting data back in there, and you're not doing versioning and things like that, it could be a problem. So using like a Git versioning strategy along with these scripted data loads allows you to be a lot more productive after doing a refresh, and it allows you to get into a better habit of doing constant refreshes from production. Once you have scripted data loads too, you can also then use continuous integration to do like Selenium or Cucumber style tests in addition to your Apex unit tests. So your unit tests, you typically write all the data in the unit tests. Those get pushed over as part of your CI strategy. They run, great. But now with scripted data loads, you can actually push data from the CI mechanism into your sandbox and then run Selenium tests against those, or any kind of user interface tests that you could dream up. So Before we get into all the guts of this, there are a couple other ways you can load data into Salesforce. There is a data import wizard, which is a native Salesforce feature. You can get to it through the regular Salesforce menus. But the problem is only certain objects are supported through it. So there's accounts, contacts, leads, solutions, and any of your custom objects are supported through the data import wizard. The problem is you can only import up to 50,000 records. So if you have more than 50,000 records, you can't use the import wizard. You got to chunk it up into batches of 50,000. So really from 50,000 on up to 5 million is where the data loader comes in as your primary option. And it's also a manual user interface, so it's not scriptable, although technically if you wanted to, you could probably script it through Selenium. Not for me though. So there are some other, there's a lot of integration tools provide the ability to do data loads. So things like Jitterbit or Informatica all have features that allow you to load data, but the problem is the features and the pricing varies from tool to tool. So like Jitterbit has a free data loader component, but other ones, you're going to pay for those things to use them. Certain cases, they might be a better fit for you depending on what you're looking to do. I think those are probably better for if you have those tools as part of your infrastructure and you're using them as really like a middleware or like an enterprise service bus where you're going to use Jitterbit to do all your integrations and stage all the orchestrations there. Maybe Jitterbit does make sense to do data loads for you. And of course, there's the Salesforce REST API, which for all the hackers out there, you could definitely script data loads through this. You could use REST calls and just kind of churn through a whole bunch of data, feeding it into your REST calls. I think larger data models could get tricky to do that way. And in most cases, that's probably not going to be your ideal way to go. So I think what we're going to talk about tonight is should fit the bill in probably 80% of the cases, depending on how much data you have, how frequent you have to load it, and things like that. So a couple of concepts about the data loader before we kind of really start digging into how we piece this all together. So data loader supports all the CRUD operations. So you can do select, insert, update, and delete. It supports the notion of these SDL files, which are really the mapping files that define your CSV columns and how they map to your Salesforce objects and field names. And then backwards as well. They also have process template files or process files, which is where you basically, it's the input to that jar file and it defines the key parameters for each operation. So we'll take a look at one of those then. Also, they're using encrypted passwords, which you need to be able to make data changes in a target org. So if you're going to do an insert, an upsert, or an update, you need to create an encrypted password that you'll then pass into the data loader. And I'll show you how to do that. So we're going to talk a lot about upserts tonight. Upsert is the preferred operation for doing your imports because upsert allows you to do multiple runs without any fear of duplicates. So what we do is, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail, external ID fields we use to basically match records when we're upserting. And it's also the mechanism by which we tie all the record relationships together. As you know, all of the most simple data models have relationships. So you're going to have to deal with relationships at some point, unless you're creating single objects with no relationships, and it's just not a realistic use case in most places. So we talk a little bit about setting up the objects. So Salesforce IDs, when you export, or basically if you do a production refresh, your full copy sandboxes will get records with IDs that match the production system. If you take the same record minus the ID, the exact same record, and load it into a sandbox, you will have a different ID. You cannot have the same IDs between dev sandboxes or QA, any kind of sandbox except for full copy and production. So that causes a problem when we go to export. So you can imagine if we have records, and we'll take a look at a little example here. We have records where we have IDs on them, and then we have related records that refer back to those main records IDs. We can't directly import them into Salesforce that way because the IDs aren't going to match. So we're not guaranteed that we're going to get the same. Not guaranteed we're going to get the same the same IDs when we do the import into the sandbox. So if we take as an example here, let me make this a little bit larger here for you.
I like Command plus.
Yeah, let me try it. Just started using Atom. Well,
Get that idea.
Imagine if you will. No, so what we have here is a very simple, and these are simple or sample export files that I did from an org. I exported the account and I exported the contacts. So I have in my sample org here, I had 2 accounts. I have ABC Computers and XYZ Consulting. And if I come over here and I look at my contacts, I have 4 contacts, and you'll see here what I'm exporting is the account ID. So the contacts have their own ID here, but then there's a relationship, a master detail relationship up to account. So we have, if you'll notice here, and you can kind of see the end of them, the top 2 end in IAW, the bottom ones end in IAX. So IAW, if we go back to account here, IAW is this first one. These are ABC Computers. IAX is XYZ Consulting. If we tried to import these into an org, it's not going to work because we've exported this out of production. Those IDs will never be created the same way in the sandbox. So we need some considerations to be able to kind of set up these relationships between our objects. And the way we're going to do that is through an external ID. So like I mentioned before, you need to use an external ID to preserve your object relationships. So what we do in our example here, and this is kind of, I'm going to recommend this as what I feel is the best practice. If I have an object that I know I'm going to export or import through this data script, to look at that and see what that does, you know, as we go through the examples here. But basically, the load ID field it's a text field with a length of 18, which is the length of the Salesforce IDs. So you kind of see where we're going here. And it gets set as an external ID. So what it does for us is, as we export the files now, we'll take a look at another example here. We take a look at a new account file after we've added this load ID. So now we put the load ID on here, okay? And if you look, it's the same thing as the ID is. It's the exact same value as the ID. And the contact now, again, same thing. It's got a load ID on it, which matches the contact ID. But now what happens is, since these are in there as an external ID, and we're going to do our upserts on those external IDs, it'll put these in here as an external, with the external ID as like the primary key. It'll create its own unique ID inside that Salesforce sandbox, but we don't really care about that because we're going to use that external ID to chain them together. So this will absolutely insert with this here, the account record. We'll insert with this value in the load ID field. That's absolutely fine. That will work because it's not your primary key, your Salesforce ID. So it's just an external ID. It's just a text field that we've specified. But then when we go to insert the contacts, we can refer back to that. And I'll show you how we do that with the mapping files. Once you see the mapping files, it'll start to make sense. So we'll get into that very shortly and take a look at those. So mapping files. They have an SDL file extension. You typically need one for export and a different one for import, because on export, you're just going to export the fields that are in your object. On import is where you map up the relationships and you tell it how to kind of work its way up and find the correct record in the related object. A mapping file is simply a text file containing a source field name, an equal sign, and a destination field name. So very simple. We'll take a look at one here in a second. And you want to remember, as you're building your mapping files, you want to use the actual Salesforce API field name and not the label. So you're going to need your underscores and your double underscore C for your custom objects. And then there's a special notation inside the mapping files for relationship fields. And we'll see that in a second here. So my recommendation is to keep things simple and use the same names in your CSV as your Salesforce API names. I mean, you don't have to respect that. If you want to, if you're going to use your CSV files for something other than just doing imports back into a Salesforce org, you want to be a little more human readable, you could change the field names. But when I create these, I always match them up so that they're, you know, perfect matches for one another. So with that said, when we look at these, they're gonna look a little silly because you're telling it basically to map the one field name to the same field name. We look at our mapping files here. So we have for our account, what we're saying here is we're going to take the value that's in the ID field and export it out to load IDC in our CSV file. Similarly, we have the Salesforce name field, and we're going to export that out to a column in our CSV file called name. We look at contact export. Same thing. We're going to take the contact ID and export that out to our external ID, our load ID field. We're going to export first name. It goes out as first name. Last name goes out as last name. Account ID goes out as account ID. So like I said, it's kind of silly because, I mean, you're telling it just map the field name to the same name. But then when we go to do the inserts, so if we look at the insert map for account, so here's where the load ID starts to kind of come into play. So when we load up the account record, we're going to map what's in that CSV file called load ID underscore C, under C, into that external field in Salesforce. Now, meanwhile, ID is going to get its own unique ID when that record gets created, unique to that sandbox. But the load ID now contains the original value of the ID from the source org that we exported from. Name just comes in as name. So all your other fields really come in the same. It's really these load IDs. So if you keep that kind of pattern in mind, when you're exporting, you're going to export the Salesforce ID into the load ID in the CSV file. And then when you import it, you simply import that load ID into the load ID field. And then Salesforce will create the ID for you. We don't care about what the Salesforce ID is. All we need is the load ID. Because if we look at the contact insert, we'll see here now, we're doing the same thing. We're putting the load ID in the load ID field. First name, last name, account ID in Salesforce is now, ooh, look at this. So now we're picking our account, and we're giving it this little notation here and telling it to match it up to the load ID on the account. So that's how we have the account ID in the record that we exported has that value. The original Salesforce ID from the source org is now in that load ID, which is what we put. That's what we have in that account ID field when we export it from contact. So that by means of matching it up to the load ID instead of the actual Salesforce ID is how it kind of ties it together. So as we start looking at the examples, it'll start making more sense. All right, so we're going to talk real quick about our directory structure that we use. So I'm going to show you kind of the way I run these data loads. I always set up the directories the same way in any Salesforce org I'm working in. The workshop that we're going to do has a set of code and scripts and all these files out in GitHub. You'll see the same directory structure out there. You can, of course, set up your own directory structure. I like to keep mine. I like this because of the way it works. And as we go through, I'll explain why I set things up the way I did. But basically, I mean, we want to keep a consistent structure across projects, so we always know where to find things. So in my directory structure, I always keep my ant build files in the root directory. Then there's a folder called data scripts. And the data scripts folder is basically, we keep a couple things in there. We have our SDL mapping files that we keep in there. It also provides us a place where we can kind of store pre-canned or staged CSV files for import. And those could be ones that we just exported, or it could be, like I mentioned before, where you have a set of 5 records that you want to always import into your developer orgs. And then you have, you know, maybe your QA sandboxes, you have 100 records because it's a more extensive set of data that you. So you could set up those CSV files and kind of stage those commit them into your version control system so that they're always out there. And then, when you have new functionality that you're adding, you want to add new records to test that out, you can add those by hand if you want to. So, there's a couple different ways you can kind of envision using this. You can either constantly export out of your production and reload it into your sandboxes, or maybe it's something where you want to have more control over it and you want to be able to kind of add to that data, by hand as you go. So it really gives you the ability to kind of do that by keeping these files in a defined location that we can always tell our build script to look for them. We have a live directory, which basically contains all the Ant and Java libraries that are needed for running the scripts. There's a properties directory, which is where we're going to store all of our property files that contain the credentials for our, logging into the Salesforce orgs. And we'll see that directory structure as we work through some of these examples here. Ant. How many people have used Ant? Good amount. Okay. So Ant is an open source scripting tool. It's part of the Apache project of open source stuff. There's dozens and dozens of components to all the Apache stuff. So you can get to it. It's out on antapache.org. And Ant basically allows you to define a set of build steps through XML target definitions. And we'll look at the build. We'll take a look at the build file, and I'll show you all this stuff. So Ant basically lets you do a lot of different things. It'll support external build tasks. It supports dependency chaining and things like that. If anyone remembers Make, that you may have used years and years and years back for building C programs and stuff like that, it's like Make, but it's 1,000 times better. And I would say maybe even 2,000 times better. It does a lot of the same things, but it's a lot more intuitive and easy to set up your scripts. So as I mentioned before, there's a jar file that we'll make use of in our Ant script to do all the data loader, basically heavy lifting. So a jar file, if you don't know, is a Java library file, and it's actually jar is an acronym that comes from Java Archive. You can find this file in your data loader directory. So if you go into Salesforce, like I show you, download data loader and install it, it'll actually somewhere in that directory structure, I don't remember exactly where, but you'll find that file. So if for some reason you want to upgrade your version of the data loader file, I recommend the best way to do it is to go get the latest version of the data loader from Salesforce. It should match the version of the Salesforce org. Take a look through the directory and try and find the jar file, and then you copy it over into this live directory that we talked about. It's named like this: data loader xx.x.x-uber.jar. The xx.x.x is the version number. So if you're on Salesforce API version number 29, it'll be like 29.0.0. So like I said, I don't remember offhand the directory it's in, but it's definitely underneath the install directory for the data loader. So if you look for that file pattern, you should find it. But lucky for you, I already have that file up in the GitHub repository that we're going to use for our sample workshop tonight. It's version, what version it's up to? I think it's 29 I have up there. So it's fairly recent. So I mentioned property files. Like I said, property files is where you store your authentication credentials for your Salesforce orgs. So either your production org or your sandboxes or whatever. We keep a couple things out there in the property file. It's your Salesforce username, the Salesforce password, plus your security token. So you'll need a security token if you haven't done that, and you generate it, via the reset my security token feature. And then we'll need an encrypted password as well, and a little bit more to come on this. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. You need an org server and the name. So, and I'll show you, this will make more sense when we look at the file, but basically we need to know which Salesforce pod it runs on, and we just create a name in there so that when we create directories for exporting the data out, we'll use that to create our directory structure. So for example, if we have like a production and we have a QA sandbox and a dev sandbox, we'll create property files for each one. And you name them, you give one the name prod, one the name of QA, one the name of dev. That way, if you're running an export from prod, it'll create a directory called prod under your temp area where it's exporting the files into. You export out a QA, now it creates a folder called QA, so that you're not overwriting and you can keep the different org files separate. Again, you can build scripts however you want. This is just the way we've chosen to build these up and kind of, structure things. And then you need the Salesforce server, whether it's test.salesforce.com or login.salesforce.com. Like I mentioned, each environment should get one of these property files. And I would recommend that you don't version these in Git because they will have passwords and credentials in them. So either put them in a Git ignore file or, just create a sample one out there that has empty credentials for people to kind of copy and then, make sure people don't check them into Git. So encrypted passwords, like I mentioned before, you have to have an encrypted password to do any kind of data updates in a target org that you're going to run the data loader on to do imports or upserts. Luckily, data loader provides this feature for you as well. There's an encryption utility that is part of the data loader, and we'll walk through how to do that, and it's also in the workshop as well. Like I mentioned, you can read data without, but you can't insert or make any changes to it. If you go into the data loader install directory, it's found under the bin directory, but also it's in the bin directory in my GitHub repository. So that's another thing that I always put in my directories in Git when I'm setting up for a new org. I always just create a copy of the data loader encryption utility, put it out there, and that way I know I'm good to go with it, and I have it if I need it, and I don't have to go hunt around in the file system to look where data loader is installed. When you run it, you encrypt the password plus the security token. So you put your password and then you append the security token right afterwards. And then basically after you do that, it'll spit out the encrypted string, and you're going to take that and copy it into your properties file. So I can show you quickly how we do that. We go here. So like I mentioned, forgive me because I'm typing on an angle here. I mentioned the directory structure real quick that I have set up, and you'll notice I have my bin directory, which is where this utility is. Data scripts we talked about, live, properties. We'll talk about orgs in a minute, and scripts is another. We'll get to these a little bit later. So those orgs gets generated when we do the export. It's kind of like my temp holding area where it exports the files into. But if we look under bin, see there's an encrypt, and then I have the Windows and the Mac Linux version out there. So if we basically run it, and when you run the workshop, you can type better than me, and also you'll get to do this, so you'll get a chance to kind of run through this. So I'm just going to pretend my password is ABC123 and my security token is XYZ. So I give it actually run, if you're familiar with kind of Unix commands or whatever, this is the way you run the application. -E is, I don't know why they chose E, but that's how you specify the password. Probably encrypt this, I guess maybe it stands for. And then there's a seed file that, again, is loaded into up here under data scripts. The seed file basically, because it's generating like a random hash, it just seeds the hash with this value. So so when we run that, like I mentioned here, it'll spit out this kind of long string here, and that's what you're going to copy into your properties file. And again, you'll get, watching this is not the same as kind of running through it hands-on, so you get an opportunity to do this in the workshop. All right, process templates. Data loader uses these things that they call process XML files to basically pass the parameters into the data loader application. So what I did was I have templates built that provide kind of a tokenized version of these process files. And again, these are already created for you in the GitHub repository. But then what happens is when you run the build targets, it'll make a copy of that template. it does token replacement based on all the properties that we pass in, and then it feeds that over to the data loader jar file, which now it has this nice process XML file that it uses to do its thing. So there's, again, they're under the data scripts directory, and there's basically one for each type of operation. Because the parameters that feed into these different operations are a little bit different, you need a different template for each operation. But basically, they allow us to kind of create this tokenized version of it. Show you these real quick. Create this tokenized version of it that then can be copied and replaced with the actual values when we're running it. So like I said, they're in data scripts. Let's see here, there's template delete process, template export process. So we take a brief look at one of these. You'll see, and it's actually a bean definition. So under the covers, I'm assuming that data loader is probably using like Spring or something like that. So you'll see, I mean, it's specifying this is the actual Java file that it's going to run. You don't really need to be too concerned about this because the build script that we're going to run takes care of all this for you. But I just wanted to show you how we have these tokens in here. So like username will get substituted with the username from your properties file. Encrypted password, and it substitutes that in. It substitutes all this stuff in through the build script, and the build script handles all this for you, so you don't need to worry about it. The name of the object you're exporting and all that stuff. So it just kind of, I'm trying to show you some of the underpinnings of how this all kind of hooks together. But again, the beautiful thing about Ant and the build script process is that we kind of, once we build these targets, you don't need to worry about that. We're going to run a single command line that's going to do an export, and it's going to kind of handle all this behind the scenes. So we're getting to that very soon. So we're down to talking about the build file. Again, there's a build file in the root of all my repositories called build.xml, and it basically that defines all your build targets and the build process for every single thing. We're only going to touch on the capabilities of Ant. I'm not going to go into a complete dissertation on Ant. If you are interested, there's a lot of good documentation out there on the Ant Apache site. I encourage you, if you want to get into using Ant, Ant's very useful for many different things, not just data load scripting. So go out there and take a look at that documentation. There's a lot of stuff out there. When we run our build script, we specify which property file to use. We pass a minus property file argument, and then we give it the path to the property file. And again, you'll see how we do all this. And then there's a concept of macros and targets. So Ant allows you to set up macros, which are predefined steps. We use them. You can set them up for all kinds of stuff, but we use them to invoke the data loader process runner command, which if you took a look at that bean definition, you saw that was the name of the Java program that runs. So like I said, it creates a copy of that process template. It does the token substitution based on everything in your property file and any other command line arguments we pass in. Then it actually invokes that Java program and with that process file. So it feeds the process file over to the Java program, and then it's off and running and it's doing its thing. So there's a couple macros I have defined in my build file. There's an SF export, Salesforce upsert, and Salesforce delete. We don't really worry about insert or update because, like I said, we're always using upsert so that we're guaranteed not to get duplicates. And then we get to targets. So we have these macros that kind of define how we're going to create these templates and feed them over to the Java program. Targets basically are what you're going to run from the command line with Ant. And targets just allow you to chain together one or more steps. So there's a couple targets we have defined. And you'll work through all these with the workshop, and we'll step through them as well here too. So there's the first one to talk about is called init data directory. And what this does in my setup here is it creates an org-specific temp subdirectory. So this is where that orgs directory that you saw there when you looked at the directory structure, this is where this comes into play. We pass the property file, like I mentioned before, and that's the only thing we do. So the actual command looks like this. We call ant init data directory minus property file. We give it a property file. So remember, we're storing all our property files under the properties folder here. And then what that'll do is it creates under org. That should actually be orgs. SANDBOX/data. So it creates that directory out there. So all this is doing is basically creating this data area, this area where we can kind of export our data into when we want to do our exports. So show you this real quick. So if I do ant, let me just remove this works. Type this way. So if I do ant init data directory, I'm going to give it a property file. Source. You see ant starts running here. It's going to show you the target that it's running, and as it runs, if it's got to chain into other targets, you'll see all the targets that it runs in succession. And it tells me the build was successful. So it did what I asked it to do. And if we look now, we have under, we list the directory out here. Oh. Oh, sorry, that's right. It does not, that was wrong there. It does not create, it deletes the old data directory. Because the export is actually going to create the directory. So if we look at our actual, so I mentioned about targets here, and you'll see this is the target I ran here. Removes and create, it doesn't recreate, okay. But it's running the delete, so it deletes that orgs, which we already had deleted, so it's not going to do anything. So, and the export will recreate it. Come back here. So that's an init data directory. We then get to our export data build target, which is one of our main ones that we're going to run. So as you might expect, this exports data from the specified org to a CSV file under that org temp subdirectory. Specified org is the org that you pass in the property file for. So you saw there I have a source and a target properties. You know, your source could be prod, it could be QA, it could be any number of different orgs that you're going to export data out of. But you specify that with your properties file, like that. Just like all the other targets, all specify a property file. We then pass the name of the object using this -D notation, and it's because those end up being Java runtime properties that we pass in. So we specify our object name there, so it would be like account or contact, and then we can specify a SOQL query, and which allows us we could set that SOQL query up to select all the items, or we could set it up to select only a subset of items. So it allows us, if we want to filter data as we're exporting it, we can do it through that. So if you look at the format of this command here, we have ant export data, our object here. So we have a custom object, hypothetical custom object called obj_c, -d SOQL. So select the ID from objc, and in our property file. So what this is going to do is this is actually going to create, it'll run through, log into the org, extract all the data, and put it into this file called, and it names them, again, there's a consistent naming format I've used that I've specified these files to get created as. So it's going to create the object name, export.csv. So if we come over, I realize now that I'm in the wrong directory. That's why my stuff's not working. So what we're going to do is we're going to do ant export data -d, and we're going to, I have a couple of test object set up. Before we go any further, I should kind of cover this. There's a couple of test objects I've set up in a source org, which is where when you do the workshop, you're gonna export everything out of there, and then you'll create a developer org and you're gonna import into the developer org. So I have test objects set up. There's like an employee. It's from the recruiting application. There's an employee, a candidate, position file, or a position object, job application, and interviewer. So it's like the standard Salesforce training objects. So we're going to export from employee here. Then we're going to specify our SOQL query. So we're going to get all the employees out of there. Now you see it. Now it's going to do a whole lot of stuff because now it's actually. Hang on. Wrong org. All right, so so you see this is all stuff that the data loader is spitting out. You don't really need to be too concerned with that. The thing you want to look for is down here, the operation has fully completed. There were 52 successful extractions and 0 errors, other than picking the wrong property file. So if we look into what we should now have is, there should be test. We have a file here, so if you look in the prop, I'll show you my properties file for that. The target properties actually has an org name of dest, so that's what's going to create. I told you how it creates whatever you have the org name specified in your properties file. It's going to create underneath the org sphere. So underneath there's data, and now it exported out to employee C export CSV. So we'll look at that. Basically, all it's doing is I have a very simple. It just exported the load ID out here because that's all I had in my SOQL. So that brings up an important part. Or an important concept here is whatever you put in your SOQL is what you're going to get exported. So if we were to go back and rerun this again, and we now put name into our SOQL query, we rerun this again, and this will just overwrite the file. So now if we look at it, now we see we got our name in there too. So whatever fields we specify that SOQL query is what it's going to pull out. So if you want to export, if you want to be able to import all your fields, you better specify those in your SOQL statement. And what we're actually going to do is we'll create scripts to script all these like export statements so that we can do an entire data model. And we'll set up all the SOQL in those scripts so that you only have to create that one time. It's not like you have to run this every single time. If you're going to do a one-off export, you can certainly do it like this. But I like creating scripts to kind of export and import the whole data model. Update data files is another little target that I've added in here. And what this basically does is it copies the files from that org subdirectory that we just saw that the export went into up under data scripts data files and then renames them to this insert format. And the reason I do that is because, like I mentioned, if you may want to run every time you run this, you want to always do an export and then an import. Or maybe you want to do an export one time and kind of massage your data and clean it up for whatever you're going to use it for loading into your sandboxes, and then version it off up there in data files. And you're not going to be running the export every single time. So it gives you kind of that flexibility. So my update targets always run out of that data scripts data files directory. So I created this little utility target just to copy everything over there. And it basically you specify the property file and that's where it knows to copy from, and it'll always copy them up into data scripts data files. So it's a very simple target there, like the other ones. Upsert data this is where the rubber starts to hit the road. So this is basically going to take the CSV file that we just copied up there into the data files and insert or upsert it into the specified org. Again, the specified org is based on which property file you choose. We also specify the object, but unlike the export, we don't need to specify SOCL here because it's just going to import or upsert whatever's in that CSV file. So this is a little bit simpler version of that command there. And like I said, it'll upsert everything from, that insert file that's up in data files. We also have a delete data target too, which basically will allow you to delete data in a specified org or a specified object name. Again, it takes a property file, takes an object, and it takes SOCL. So if you only want to delete a single record, you can specify that record through your SOCL and only run the delete on that record instead of doing all the records. So this is kind of the format for that. It looks similar to the export command. A lot of these have the same kind of format. So basically now we kind of bring everything together, and what we want to do is we create a script, which it could either be like a bash .sh file or Windows batch file to invoke multiple ant commands. I have an export script that I've created. I call the init data directory first. Then we call export data for each object that I want to export. And the order does not matter for the exports. But like I mentioned before, you want to remember to include all the fields you have in your mapping file in your SOCL statement when you're setting those up. Then you're going to want to create an import script too, which basically will call upsert data for every object that you want to import. The order matters with imports, so that's an important thing to remember, is you're going to want to do objects that have no lookups or master detail relationships, upsert those first. Because if you have relationships and the object that you're referring to has not been imported yet, you're going to get errors. So once you have all your your core objects, then you're going to want to look at dependency order and kind of set up your imports to run in that order. Some other notes about putting the scripts together. You want to disable your triggers prior to running the import so you don't hit governor limit exceptions. That will happen with larger data models if you got a lot of triggers on them. You want to make sure you run update if you're doing an export then followed by an import. You want to run that update data files, at least with the way I have things set up. And you can invoke these import scripts, like I mentioned before, from like a continuous integration, continuous deployment environment to be able to preload your sandboxes if you're going to do some kind of like UI testing. And of course, I have mine set up so I just pass property file in as an argument. So I can run export, import with basically 2 commands and then for any number of different orgs. So it's so easy, why don't you do it? That's exactly what we're going to do. I have some links here. The workshop guide you can get to up there. I don't know if you want to post that in the meetup, maybe Peter. There is, and all this stuff is detailed in the workshop guide. It's pretty detailed instructions on how to go through stuff. There's an unmanaged package I have that'll set up all the objects and tabs for you once you create your developer org. And then all the stuff that we looked at, all the build files and stuff like that are all up in the GitHub repository. So again, if you go to the workshop guide, all these links are in there. You can just click on them right there. So if you have any issues getting stuff set up, or just let me know. I'm glad to help.
I do have a question.
Yes.
It's 1B, and then you have.
Yeah, I don't know. It's I think it's an L then a capital I. Or maybe it's an I and then a capital L. Yeah, that was a terrible Billy.
Yeah, because if you put 2 L's,
It's capital I then an L.
Capital I then an L. Sorry about that.
Yeah, because if you put 2 L's, it doesn't work.
I was waiting to see if everyone would catch that.
So if you're gonna script out your export, is it all considered one transaction? So if you have so the product I work on is like 190 objects.
Mm-hmm.
So to pull out relevant data, we're gonna load through the limits. It's a single transaction.
So each invocation of the export data ant build target is a single transaction.
Okay.
So typically that's gonna be one object though, right?
Okay.
So Yeah, I mean, you could hit sockle limits on how many rows you return.
Yeah.
So that's something to be, kind of, if you have a huge, I mean, I would argue that why do you want to export that many rows and import? I mean, you're not going to need that many rows for tests. Although if you're doing like a true backup for disaster recovery or something like that, then you're going to, then you would probably want to somehow chunk it up and make multiple calls for each object and just,
Can you
structure
dynamically
sockle.
change your sockle queries as you go down? So say you select.
you could do that with Ant. You could tokenize them and have them.
Okay, so you
put
get
a
like,
counter and,
you want to get like the first 100 accounts, and then you want all the opportunities on those accounts.
Yeah, you would be able to. Ant has some provisions that you could do something like that.
That's very cool.
Any other questions before you get into the workshop? John?
Is there a way to get the most recent version of the data loader, that jar file, if you're working on Mac, or you need access to the Windows machine to download that?
As far as I know, you need access to the Windows machine, but that's a good question. I'll see if I can get an answer for you and post it in the Medium.
I mean, it's up on GitHub, so that's a step in my direction.
Yeah, but it's version 29. I haven't even updated mine, so yeah. It's just discrimination against Mac users.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you very much.
Sure.